welcome back. Our first talk is going to be from Dr. Alastair Sutcliffe from London. He's a paediatrician, and he's going to be talking about what's known about the health outcomes for children born after PGD or PGS. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the lovely catering. I certainly did. It's a real pleasure to come to talk here. I was invited by Professor Fischel, who has the dubious privilege of also inviting me to my first international speaker engagement, which is an embarrassingly long time ago. That was in Rome, in fact. I was just reflecting on that. So I realise I'm an outlier in this audience because my job is to look after children, and also I do research. I'm a professor at UCL. Is there anybody else who does paediatrics in the audience? No. Oh, right, there's a confession. What do you do? You're a paediatrician, are you? Oh, right. Okay. Okay, yes, an allied profession. So yes, thank you for inviting me, and I'll try and enlighten you about what I know about studies involving specifically pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and try and give you a bit of a quick overview of what's known about ART-conceived children as a whole, because I think that's potentially useful for you in your practice. So when I think about children born after ART, I'm fond of a quote, and this was said to me by somebody when I was travelling, in fact, up to Simon Fischel's unit in Nottingham. In fact, it was 2 units, and I, amongst many times, this is years and years ago, was studying children conceived after ICSI, and I was asked, what's ICSI, by a man, and he said that in response, and he clearly had some idea, so I've decided to make him world famous. He's in my book, he's been in every talk I've given in every country, I've been all over the world. Dave, taxi cab driver, Nottingham, England, and I kid you not, I don't know his surname, but he's quoted amongst the greats in my books on this subject, etc. But I think he probably had a point, and let's give a bit of respect to him for coming out with that as a synopsis. So there we are, Dave. He always gets a quote. Warm up the audience. So, as we know, as any of us you are parents, people are inevitably concerned about their children. They're concerned when their children are ill, as in this picture where a child's in an accident emergency department somewhere in Australia, as it happens. I think that captures that sort of concept. And parents worry, and I'm going to show you a little bit later a small project where we asked families who conceived their children with ART what their concerns were about their children. But whatever the case, they also need to be interacted with. And this little princess who's now 17, and as far as I know, a naturally conceived child, since she's my own youngest child, was modelling on how to do a certain kind of developmental assessment where we're essentially measuring the IQ of the children. So that's an example of that little thing with special games appropriate for a 2-year-old. This little girl, a Belgian child, she was part of a large European project that I led, and what she's having done there is having her hearing tested, so she's diligently putting up her hand when she hears the sound in her right ear. So that's another example of what we do. And just to mention, I think there's always been a very, very perhaps excessive interest amongst the fertility community with congenital anomalies, but they're only one of the potential things that we should think about when talking about children born after ART. And there's a large literature in that which is pretty consistent and tends to show, this is just one of my patients in my outpatients, as a matter of fact, it tends to show that there's about a 1.3 times the risk from ART conception in relation to natural conception. But of course the press will report that as 30% higher, which I don't think is very helpful, really. But that's the balance of a large literature. So what's known about PGD and the specific outcomes regarding that? That's just to show we have ethical guidance regarding our interactions with children, which we have to follow. It's not as simple as just, oh, you've got to come to this study, you've got to volunteer. So I work at this institution, and in fact, a small group of us did a small study. It was actually the first in the world, looking at health of children born after PGD, and this was a London-based study, and you can see the numbers were small, as they are in a lot of these studies. And what we did here was we got children born in 4 clinics in London who'd had this PGD process in addition to in vitro fertilisation of various forms. We got naturally conceived children, and we did some studies of them doing various developmental assessments, etc. And we didn't really find much difference between them. We found that they were more likely to be low birth weight and premature, but that's a general observation about IVF children as a whole. I don't think it's special to PGD. Following that, there were some other projects at very similar times. Julie Neckerbrook, who worked with me, and Maryse Bonduel's psychologist, researcher, did a similar study with a similar sort of size. No significant difference across mental, motor, language and social development. Julie followed that up with another study. Not quite sure why she did 2, and nobody's really separated off PGD and PGS. I don't see it as relevant. I think they should be considered the same, largely for purposes of this kind of research. She found naturally conceived children had lower scores on the language development, but it's a very small cohort size. These were twins rather than singletons. Twins are especially problematic to study because so many of them are from ART. It's very hard to get appropriate control children to compare them with. There's been some other studies, cardiometabolic outcomes, no significant difference between these two groups. People may be aware of a rather unusual Swiss study where they contrived to take some adolescents up to the top of a Swiss mountain and test their intimal resistance and such things. Not good science. The later project in that area was reviewed by me, and I know it's not going forward with the Swiss equivalent of the MRC because the science just wasn't frankly up to it, and it was sensationalising alleged changes between ART-conceived young people and then naturally conceived comparison groups in terms of their cardiometabolic risks. Psychosocial functioning, this project's been done again, small. You can see the sort of sizes of these studies. They're all small, and that's obviously because they were done in an emerging picture. Again, this is pretty well the total literature available on children, and so it's not a lot of information for you. I hope just after lunch. I hope you're not nodding off just yet. Anyway, so people look at various outcomes here. As you can see, small groups of children, different countries, the Netherlands here, and in Hellas, in Greece here, and you'll notice the NS not significant. Frankly, if there was slight differences between the groups, the whole problem with these sorts of sizes of studies is it's okay if the groups are the same, but if there's a difference, how do you explain it? Only studies I managed to find in the literature were of any substance. Well, this study done in Israel, 89 children PGD, naturally conceived 166. They looked at obstetric and neonatal outcomes and malformations. No significant difference, but you need thousands to detect a real valid malformation difference rate. And although this looks on the face of it, you think, wow, what's that number there? But in fact, it's 149 PGD children from the excellent Danish epidemiologists did a lot of good work there, looking at obstetric and neonatal outcomes. And here I was saying to Simon Fischel earlier today, the only difference was that found in PGD due to parental monogenetic disorders. I mean, I don't think that's difficult to explain why, is it? So in other respects, there really wasn't anything at all. And that's pretty well it in terms of what's known explicitly about children conceived, where they've also had the PGD. That's pretty well it. The final one was this study in Israel, which was published in 2014. It's got the biggest group, 242. It was a prospective study, so quite well done in that sense. 242 conceived with ICSI, 733 were naturally conceived, and they concluded that embryo biopsy did not cause growth restriction, which I think is a believable and plausible thing. So that's the biggest study in the literature today. So we're in an area where there is plenty of opportunity and no money for the research. Having said that, that's the situation today. I'm going to move on to a few other things before I finish. So small or convenient samples, youngest children, limited inclusion of confounders, and then obviously what we're moving to, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of a study of this nature, broader IVF, large population-based studies, and we'd like to know about underlying parental conditions where possible. And obviously one of the things that might help that going forwards, the HFEA in Britain have this registry, then they ask for consent, and then the rates of participation dropped off. They've picked up more recently, but saying we don't mind using this information for research as long as it's anonymised doesn't seem to be asking a lot. But if it's on the 6th page of a large consent form, people think, I just came here to have a baby, what's all this stuff, So here's this little study we did some years ago just to give you a feel for what parents worry about, and you'll see there's a massive range of things, all saying, oh, could this be due to ART? And it's obvious to me as a paediatrician that virtually none of these have any chance whatsoever of being due to the ART process, whether it's PGD or IVF, ICSI, whatever. But this is the kind of thing that parents come up with. It could be this, could it be that, could it be this. And that's because it's a sentinel event for them, and they can associate those two things in time. But it was quite interesting. We're getting these envelopes we're sending out to these families throughout the United Kingdom. One of the things they did ask about was childhood cancer. Was there a higher risk of childhood cancer after assisted conception? And so we thought we should study that, and we set about doing it. One of the families that got in touch with me, their daughter, there's a mother and daughter. The dad was donor sperm, and she was a very talented young lady. She's now an adult, and she did this rather macabre painting. You see this R.I.P. Rest in Peace, it stands for. And you've got this baby, and then you've got a face with one eye missing. I've had permission to use this rather macabre picture, but I think it creates a very strong image. And then this is a likeness of the individual concerned. And what you've got there is you've got a sperm over sort of trying to lie over somebody's eye, and you got a sort of monster thing. And what had happened to this young lady was she'd unfortunately had one of her eyes taken out as a baby, and the reason why she'd had her eye taken out is because she had retinoblastoma, and she'd got the retinoblastoma courtesy of donor conception. So the gene was on the donor sperm. And although this was some 18 years later, this family got in touch with me when they knew I was doing a little study about retinoblastoma in view of some questionable Dutch research, which was in the Lancet, suggesting there was an increased risk after ART. So I think it really captures an image of what people think about and worry about. And they clearly never come to terms with the fact that she'd got this cancer, despite the fact she was super bright, went to Durham University, very high achieving young person, but this was the thing they were focusing on. So we decided to do this study looking at the cancer risk in children born after assisted conception. I just want to briefly overview it, because this is really the way my work in this area, and it's only maybe a quarter of my total research activities, is going forward. We was given grants by I was given grants by Cancer Research UK. We engaged with this organisation, of which a number of you in the audience have contributed data to, and this organisation, the National Institute for Health Research. And a bunch of us got together to do this work, and of course we were interested in the conceived IVF children, not adults, like this young lady. Yeah, I think you recognise that. Why did we want to do this? Well, the study was driven by parental concern. I think I've illustrated that, but also there's potential mechanisms which a lot of you clever people in the audience will understand a lot better than I do, to say there might be a risk of cancer. But the other thing is, conceptually, I was lucky to speak in front of David Barker when he was retired, and David Barker came across this concept, very important concept, of resilience. Human beings have resilience, and if they're born with resilience, they'll live a longer age. If they don't have resilience, they'll die younger. And one of the things that measures resilience in a population, of course, is cancer and its risk. So you could say it's worth studying cancer risk in children born after ART as a whole, including PGD, and find out whether they've got a high risk of cancer in childhood, and maybe that would be a harbinger for the future. But also, is this a concept with regards to their resilience for other disease processes? So obviously there's special subgroups of children where there might be a high risk of imprinting disorders such as Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, which I described in 1985 as associated with ART conception, and that's been proven to go on and so forth. So what did we do here? This looks beautifully simple conceptually, but took us 5 years to do. Sorry, the unintended pun on conceptually. We linked these two data sets. This data set's the world's largest childhood cancer registry, and this was the world's largest registry of children and indeed women children born after ART connected via their mothers. So we took all the records, and reporting was compulsory up to 2010, and we took this registry and we combined the two together. So we took these 106,000 children. These were born in Scotland and Wales. Between these two time periods, we didn't use the donor children because of special sensitivities. We're publishing those shortly as a separate paper. And the National Registry of Childhood Cancers, Childhood Tumours, which unfortunately has that number of children over a considerable period of time. There's about 1,500 cancers in the UK per year between those time. And these were below 15 because the nature of childhood cancer changes at about that age to more like an adolescent thing. So we linked these two together, this was the number of follow-up years. It was actually over 700,000 follow-up years, and we did the expected cases based on the annual age-specific incidence observed versus expected. So, read my lips. No more cancer. It was a great day when we got this result. I'm scientifically neutral in all these studies, but the standardized incidence ratio was 0.98. This paper, by the way, was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, if anybody wants to have a look at it, in greater detail with reasonably tight confidence intervals. So the overall risk for cancer in children in the United Kingdom born over this period who'd been conceived by various types of IVF was exactly that, almost exactly that of the background population. So this was a very, very satisfying piece of work. There were kick-ups in two rare forms of cancer, hepatoblastoma and rhabdomyosarcoma, and I could explain why they might be slightly kicked up, but you'll notice the confidence intervals are extremely wide, and the reason is that these are very, very rare types of childhood tumour. So we stratified across a whole variety of things for anybody who's hawkish in the audience, and we didn't find any difference from those. We looked at hepatoblastoma, rhabdomyosarcoma, more difference, but I'll skip through that. So no overall increased risk of that. And then we had these small rare tumours, which we've probably got explanations as to why they appeared to be increased. Those are the people I worked with. I just want to summarise the known literature in a couple of slides of what's known on the whole about ART children. So if you're not listening, listen now. Take some Ritalin. Open your ears, because this is what you're going to be telling to people in your clinics. Multiple pregnancies are the biggest risk. I think we know that, although they're rapidly going down across the world. There's an increased risk of preterm delivery. There's an increased risk of perinatal mortality, albeit not very great. There's an increased risk of small for gestational age. This is for singletons as well. There is an increased risk of congenital anomalies, which I've made reference to earlier in this brief presentation. And there is an increased risk of certain rare epigenetic abnormalities such as Beckwith's, which I've referred to earlier. Neurodevelopmental risks. No certain evidence of an effect across any of the groups that have been studied. There's an alleged increased risk of cerebral palsy, but that's probably explained by low birth weight and multiples. Psychosocial development is normal and has been studied particularly extensively by my own collaborations with European colleagues. No increased risk of childhood cancer, as far as we know. And there's what I call the gophers, people who work for me in research. You know, the golden rule, if there's a fire, data out first, personnel second. They don't all do. And my final message for the audience, in various languages, to which I've just added Spanish, and I've got it in a variety of other languages that go around the world. Thank you very much.